Welcome to Crossroads. I'm your host, Joshua Phillip, and today we have with us Bill Meierling from the American Legislation Exchange Council. That's ALEC. And Bill, real pleasure having you here today. We're going to talk about what ALEC stands for and what you guys do. So tell us a bit about your work.
Well, thanks so much for having me on your show, Josh. ALEC is the nation's largest organization dedicated to limited government, free markets, and federalism. We bring legislators together to share ideas across the 50 states because there's no one right way to do things. And legislators benefit from the opportunity to speak with one another, share ideas, and see what works and what hasn't. We've been doing it for 46 years, and we've been wildly effective.
So, limited government, what a concept. Right?
That's right, free markets and free people.
Yeah. So I guess what is kind of the founding principle that you look for, that you started with, I should say, when it comes to limited government and free markets and these types of things? I think we're seeing a trend in society right now where, ironically, the idea of limited government and free markets is seen as oppressive, while for some reason, almost absolute government control is seen like unoppressive. I can't even keep track of where people are at mentally these days when it comes to this stuff, to be honest. I have friends who used to be more anarchistic, and now they're like socialists, and they somehow have gone from thinking that government was this thing they wanted to oppose to believing government was their greatest protector. And I'm like, well, how has government ever represented that in the last 100 years? It was the greatest source of tyranny and murder and genocide and you name it. Right? How do you draw these conclusions? And I think it's because they've come to see business as being a greater threat to freedom than government, and they've somehow aligned with government. But it's a very odd balance, and I'm wondering if maybe we could look at some of these understandings that people have these days and maybe bring some different perspectives to it.
Well, that's absolutely right. There's a real challenge today in American civil society, and I think around the world. Scott Rasmussen had a poll that came out a couple months ago where he talked to millennials about their feelings of socialism in government, and he indicated in his polling, the data indicated rather, that the vast majority of millennials believe that socialism is good, but it's because they believe socialism is more about palimony, about social engagement with one another, as opposed to the definition of what a socialist government or socialist state is. Juxtapose that idea of friendship and harmony with the free market. Well, what they say they actually believe is in a free market. What was interesting, if you dug down in the data, of those millennials that believed socialism was good, 80% believed there should be less government.
Very interesting.
So there's an opportunity here for all of us to engage misguided folks and help them better understand how, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. What we really need to be focusing on is how limited government empowers an individual, and how, of course, regulation is necessary to a certain degree, but we want the lowest possible regulatory state to create a fair and equal playing field that incentivizes the free market and individual liberty.
Well, and that's an interesting point, right? It's the bigger the government, the smaller the man, right? That was the saying.
That's right.
And I guess how would you explain this to a young person today? It's an interesting point now that I saw that poll. I didn't dig into the data like you did on that, but showing that it's a good point that while they may say they believe in socialism, they believe in smaller government, but in reality those two are absolute opposites.
That's right.
Socialism is, let's go into the definition of it, right? Or say the original meaning of it, because the original meaning has been changed, or reinterpreted, I should say, right, or misrepresented. When Marx, created this whole idea, and keep in mind, communism and socialism were mostly used interchangeably until Lenin's Bolshevik Revolution. Communism was kind of seen as the end goal, this imaginary utopian state that socialism would achieve, right? He talked about the 5 stages of civilization: primitive communism, agrarian society, capitalism, socialism, communism. At the time of them, Marx and stuff, there was no such thing as a socialist or communist government. And Marx even was very vague on what the socialist system would look like, or what the communist goal would look like. Because he said these are things of the future, and they're future forms of society's evolution, and you can't imagine what they will be. And so different socialist organizations came about, different movements came about, trying to interpret how to organize society in a state such as to achieve their envisioned goal of communism. And what was that? Socialism was a state of the dictatorship of the proletariat. It was a state capitalist monopoly, where as Lenin called it, where the system, the government, seizes control of all means of production and all institutions, where the government controls everything. It was a totalitarian system. And of course, there are different degrees of socialism which have achieved totalitarianism to different degrees. And so I think, people should understand that the real goal of it is to have complete dominance. And the purpose of that dominance was to achieve communism. Communism being this idea, this fanciful idea Marx had of what society would look like if we were to eliminate all previously existing institutions, including morality, traditions, beliefs, family institutions, everything. It wasn't just an economic thing. The idea of socialism was to seize the means of production, to take from the average person all the faculties of individual liberty, put them under state power, and to use that power to drive society towards that goal. And so socialism is absolutely opposed to the idea of small government. It represents big government, and it in no way represents getting rid of greed and big business and these types of things. In fact, Marx envisioned this technological communism, right? He believed, he embraced the idea of society's evolution as he interpreted it into this, where the factories would head, even though in his earlier writings, for example, he criticized the factories and such. So it was a very bizarre theory that had a lot of self-contradictions. Even in, Das Kapital, he starts off with criticisms of all past things and all this revision of human history, which is, really based on a lot of half-truths and jumps in logic. And then moving into this, the latter part where he does talk about this technological communism and higher society and stuff like that, which ironically comes about through the capitalist system. He contradicts his earlier writings. But I think modern socialists, they have no idea what any of this stuff is. They don't realize what they're getting behind. And so how do you start to explain to them? I mean, this is kind of my theory too. A lot of the people I know who do identify with socialism do so because they oppose monopoly and tyranny. They don't understand that socialism is the cause, one of the most serious causes of these things. And so how do you begin to explain this to people, I think, especially when they've been indoctrinated to where they don't want to listen to you?
I take it out of the United States. I talk about my family's home country of Nicaragua. In Nicaragua, we have a changing landscape on a constant basis, and it's very clearly documented. With a socialist dictator in Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega. Daniel changed the Constitution at his will. They use the rules to benefit themselves on an ongoing basis. And so you appeal to a sense of equity. Is it okay to change the rules to suit you at any time? Is it okay to change the Constitution when you're only allowed to be president once, so you can be president 3 or 5 or 6 times? Is it okay to raise taxes on businesses when the pension goes belly up because the government raided it, and now the companies will bear the burden of bailing out the government? And these are all real issues. And in fact, and it's very sad to think, just last April in Nicaragua, after that pension issue happened that I mentioned, the students took to the streets and the government killed them. It's all in the news. It's all clearly documented. And this is real, and it happened 365 days ago. Think about that and appeal to people's sense of equity and justice. And ask, is that what you believe? And the response is always, no, not at all. You say, well, what do you believe? Do you believe in individual liberty and your right to grow and innovate? And then they say, yes. They say, do you have good ideas? Yes. Do you believe your ideas are better than other people's ideas? Yes. Should you be able to espouse those ideas, express them? Yes. Welcome, friend. You're a capitalist. You care about individual liberty and limited government. And you always see kind of a tick or something like, wow, I didn't realize that. And certainly that's an easy way to explain it, and that doesn't get everyone. But there are so many examples of good limited government action. There are so many examples of opportunity created by partnership between the government and business together. It's not a mutually exclusive situation. It's not that government is good or bad or business is good or bad. It's that together, working together, having dialogue and creating opportunity together, we can create change.
It's a very, very good point. And I think this is also where even the ideas of liberalism have been misinterpreted. Liberalism in its original sense was the idea of liberty, right? And the irony is that today's libertarians are closer to classical liberals than modern liberals. It's a really bizarre state where what is considered the right is actually closer to what the Democrats used to be. And how did we get to this state? I mean, really, what happened in our society where it's become like this? What is your take on this?
Our American civil society right now is confused. Everyone wants whatever they want whenever they want it. And if only life was that easy. I want a lot of things, but I know I have to work very hard for them. I have to earn it. And I don't mean financially earn it. I mean, I have to be invested personally in what I'm doing. And I don't see that happening a lot in our culture. Our culture in our society today is a blameless culture. Oh, I did something bad. There shouldn't be repercussions. There shouldn't be consequences. And I think that understanding of how A begets B is a very important thing to right the ship and get people to better understand what civil society should be.
Well, and this is an interesting point. I think it ties into even the example that you mentioned in Nicaragua. It ties into the idea of whether we're a constitutional republic or a democracy, whether things can be changed on a whim, whether society can be reinvented as we see fit in the moment based on whatever the whim on the moment is, and what the consequences of that are. That was one of the early, I mentioned in the show before, one of the early discussions about the United States and what a constitutional republic was as opposed to a democracy. And the idea was that we are a society of laws, where there is a law higher than government itself, and that is the Constitution. And that cannot be changed by government or by mob rule. Because sometimes people in the moment want to make changes to that, right, to the laws to fit their interests in that moment. For example, who's to say a group of people gathering together in a building and want to, say hang someone, they raise their hands and the majority says yes, do it. Does it then become right to do so? The Constitution says no, democracy says yes.
That's right. Majority rule doesn't necessarily work.
And then what happens when the government has that power to change the law as it sees fit in any moment? And I think what you mentioned about Nicaragua is a perfect example of that.
Well, and one step further, in all of Latin America together, the vast majority of Latin American countries have based their constitution on the United States Constitution. But nearly every single Latin American country has amended their constitution at least twice in the past 50 years. So they're changing and iterating on a regular basis, but more often than not under the hands of a dictator or a socialist regime, not under a democratic process or a constitutional process.
It's interesting. And I think this is one point people get lost at when we talk about Latin America and the problems in Latin America, where a lot of the problems were caused by socialism. If you look at the whole pink revolution and the problems that caused, right? And even going back earlier to, some of the land reforms, say in Mexico, where they seized all the land from the property owners and gave it to the peasants, and the land failed, and some people, because of religion, refused to take it, and so they were left with nothing. That caused the first massive wave of immigration into the U.S. It was socialism that caused that. Socialism was the source of misery that caused that. And they come here, and I think because of race narratives and things like that, people get pushed into this idea where they think Republicans represent this, anti-immigrant stance, and Democrats will give you all the stuff you need and want to cater to your wants in the moment, right? I mean, how do you deal with this narrative? And I guess coming, maybe in your own experience, coming from a country like that, how do you approach this issue?
Let me tell you a little story about Nicaragua, and I promise I'll bring it back to the United States in terms of socialism and challenges in terms of how they engage community or don't think about property rights. Year in and year out, the Nicaraguan government makes claims that they're interested in building a new canal. They want to compete with the Panama Canal. Interestingly enough, during the gold rush, most Americans that came from New York to go over to California went through Nicaragua. It's very easy to cross because there's a deep river that goes almost all the way from the Caribbean all the way over to the Pacific. There's only about a 17-mile walk from the lake to the Pacific Ocean. So you can sail ocean-going vessels into this river, Rio San Juan. So instead of using that, they decided to displace thousands of indigenous people and dig a channel through the widest part of the country, because that makes sense. But that's what a socialist government does. They use their central planning and their central approach absent any logic or community investment or community engagement. The Politburo decides what they will do, and then that is what they do, regardless of anything else. Here in our country, we have such a wonderful grassroots up approach that people forget they have. When I talk to folks not fully aware of government, they talk about the government as if it's in Washington, D.C., and then they might pair the government with, I need to make sure my streetlights are on. Well, that's your municipality. And we have such a great opportunity here with the levels of power between the local government, the state government, and the federal government. And in that case, the people hold the power. Individuals hold the power because there are many levers that they can apply to share their ideas with everyone.
That's very interesting. And actually that ties into even an idea of what capitalism is. Capitalism, of course, is the ability of the individual to engage in trade, the ability of us to own property, the ability of us to try to build our dreams, right? Socialism doesn't get rid of the business part. It doesn't get rid of the factory part. No socialist country ever got rid of that, whether it be the Soviet Union, today's Chinese Communist Party, even regimes like the Khmer Rouge under Pol Pot, which emerged from an agrarian society anyways. They still have to organize people into forced labor of some kind in state businesses where people are assigned. Even Adolf Hitler and his shopkeeper policy, where the government took control of businesses and assigned heads of businesses. It's all the same, right?
It just changes who gets rich.
The question of capitalism is whether the individual, people like you and I, can try to engage in the market and build our own things. And the market itself, the free market, has an element of democracy built into it. Ludwig von Mises had some interesting writings about this. A classical liberal, really, right? And an economist, although these days probably considered a libertarian, but classical liberal in his days, where he talked about, you're talking about the digging of the canal. Is that a logical decision to dig a new one when you already have something that exists that makes much more sense to do? Is that there's a feedback system in the free market where if something is not a good idea, right, people don't buy it. People don't support it. It doesn't get money and it fails. And then the company has repercussions to face. It has consequences for doing something that the people did not support or want. Government does not have that. There is no feedback system in government. And oftentimes if there is feedback, the government can say, oh, well, I don't want to hear it. And if the people become too loud, then they can repress the people because they're the ones who write the laws and control the guns or whatever. And so this is an interesting principle you talked about. In a real example of it on how, say, the micromanaging of government over society, the attempts to micromanage decisions like this oftentimes overlook real practical decisions or practical information.
And let me juxtapose that narrative against how an ALEC legislator more often than not approaches public policy. It's a common adage within our organization that the legislators brought to me. This isn't my thinking, this is something they educated me on. When many of our state legislators receive inquiry about a potential public policy, they ask two questions. Is this the role of government? And if so, at what level? So it's always important to think about who should legislate and if they should legislate, and if so, where it should be legislated. Certainly some things must be federalized. Most things should be the dominion of the state, and some things should be at the local level. The 10th Amendment calls for states to be co-equal with the federal government. And largely speaking, states have reasserted their role and are continuing to push that.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, is that people believe the government should represent things that in the past it did not represent. They've lost, I think this is one of the consequences of people losing the idea of self-reliance. The idea of people losing the culture that allowed them to take care of themselves and build their own dreams and build their own communities and work within their own communities. We have the artificial community under communism, right? The artificial state-enforced collective, where they call it a community, where it's really just slavery. You don't have a choice within it. You are forced within it. You are manipulated by the whims of the collective, and you don't have a say in whether you do that or not. As opposed to the traditional one, where you as an individual could choose how you lived your life. You as an individual could choose what you did in life, and whether you succeeded or failed was often determined by how much work you put into it and the small decisions you made. You were responsible for yourself. And I think maybe it's that lack of empowerment, ironically, that lack of the ability, that empowerment that allowed for free will, that has caused people to want an external force to come in and step in and basically, take them by the hand and, baby them their whole lives, which is kind of the cradle of big government. It's a sad picture to see, in my opinion, and it really does rewrite the ideas of what government is, what role government should play in our lives. Yeah.
That's exactly right. We have a real opportunity at ALEC to help people better understand that, to better understand the appropriate role of government and individual liberty. Each person has dominion over themselves. We certainly know that it's natural law, I am my own master and commander. The challenge therein is people are ceding their own authority because they're believing that government can do it better. Government has never done anything better ever, anywhere. Ever. And I need to put a fine point on that because that's the reality of it. And let's just go to human ego. Everyone always believes they have the best idea. So why in this one case would you believe you don't have the best idea? The reality is people will be better for themselves and will do better for themselves than if they let government intrude. And nonprofits on the left and the right better understand that. They seek private money from private foundations to create partnerships with business to create community change. They more often than not do it absent government. Government contracts with these nonprofits to provide programs to the public because they're more efficient and effective than government. And that seems to me like an appropriate role for government. If they're the general rule setter and purveyor of ideas to the private sector to create opportunity for individuals, that seems like a really good balance.
And it's interesting that this ties ironically into classical liberal ideas of individuals like Frederick Bastiat in the law. Even classical, I guess you could call them conservatives like G.K. Chesterton, people who opposed socialism but also opposed big business. At least monopoly when we talk about big business, not necessarily business itself, is the idea that people can talk about not wanting a small collective to control their interests, and they believe government is the solution to that. But they forget that government is oftentimes controlled also by a small collective of individuals who are no different from you and I. How is the how is the government able to make better decisions than a business that has actual consequences if it makes the wrong decision, as opposed to government, which doesn't really have to face consequences? And we've seen again and again the real consequences in government that do affect individuals but do not affect the power of the regime. Socialism being one of the main ones, where, say, for example, Lenin's seizing seeds from the farmers and causing mass starvation. Mao Zedong doing the same thing, causing mass starvation. Pol Pot causing mass starvation. That the consequences are real, but the government itself does not seem to have to deal with those consequences as a business would have to, right?
That's right. That's right. Government oftentimes can be considered unaccountable because if there's a failure, you just appropriate more money and continue until it's successful. It's like digging a canal through Nicaragua. The reality is businesses are accountable because they're accountable to shareholders. Businesses are accountable because they're accountable to the products they sell. People will not buy products that harm them. And that is where the free market helps.
Great. So where can people learn more about your organization?
Check out ALEC.org. It's an incredible wealth of information. We have more than 900 policies that are available for anyone, member or not, to take a look at, agree with, disagree with, share, edit, and amend. That's the neat thing about the ALEC Exchange. Similarly, we have a wealth of information on tax policy at richstatespoorstates.org and education policy at alecreportcard.org.
Great. Real pleasure having you on the show. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Great. And everyone, please remember to like and subscribe. See you next time.